Welcome, dear viewers, to the sealed room, the place where buried truths rise again and the shadows of history finally speak. Tonight we open not a wooden door, but a door made of roots and fog. A door that stands in the deep forest where the trees lean close together and the ground remembers footsteps long after the men who made them have turned to dust. Listen carefully and you will hear the forest breathing, the slow drip of rain from leaves, the hush of moss swaying from branches, the distant cry of birds that do not care about human borders. In such places, history does not vanish. It sinks into the soil. It waits, and sometimes it waits for a man. This is the story of a runaway slave who learned the forest's secrets, a man the hunters believed they were chasing, a man who would quietly turn the hunt around. Before the end, 9 armed bounty hunters would enter that forest looking for him. Only the forest would leave with them. But before there was a hunter, there was a boy. He was born on a plantation that sat between a slow river and a thick wall of trees. The land was wide and rich, the soil dark and heavy, perfect for growing the crops that filled the owner's pockets. The fields stretched so far that on some mornings the mist made them look like an endless gray ocean. The plantation house stood on a small rise like a proud white bird watching everything beneath it. From its windows the owner could see the fields, the barns, the long dirt road, and the small cabins where the enslaved lived, packed together like tools left in a shed. The boy grew up in one of those cabins. The room smelled of damp wood and smoke. The floor creaked under bare feet. When rain came hard, drops slipped through the roof and tapped slowly into metal bowls placed carefully to catch them. His mother slept beside him on a thin pallet made from rough cloth and straw. She was quiet most of the time, the kind of quiet that comes from years of listening more than speaking. When the other cabins had gone silent, and when the other cabins had gone silent and the overseer's lantern had disappeared back toward the big house, she would whisper stories to him. Not stories from the plantation, stories from before. She spoke of rivers that ran wide and free, of drums that echoed through villages under moonlight, of ancestors who walked tall without fear of chains or dogs. Her voice carried those memories like fragile glass across an ocean of darkness. And then sometimes, her voice would grow even softer. She would speak of the forest. Beyond the last fence, beyond the cotton rows and the grazing animals, there stood a dense wall of trees so thick that even the sunlight struggled to reach the ground. To the plantation owners, it was only wilderness, something to be cut down later when more land was needed. But to those who whispered in the cabins at night, the forest was something else. It was possibility. His mother told him about people who lived deep inside it, people who had escaped the plantations and vanished into the green darkness where the white men's horses stumbled and their maps became useless. The Maroons, runaways who had learned the forest so well that it had become their shield and their weapon. The boy listened to these stories the way thirsty soil listens to rain. He imagined the hidden villages among the trees, the quiet fires burning beneath thick leaves, the watchful eyes of people who refused to live in chains. But stories are only wind until life forces them to become something more. The boy grew taller. His shoulders broadened from long days carrying water and hauling wood. His hands hardened from working the soil. His back learned the rhythm of labor from sunrise until darkness. He did what he was told. On a plantation, survival often means learning when to remain silent. But the overseer noticed him. The overseer was a hard man with narrow eyes and a mouth that seemed permanently twisted into a sneer. He believed fear was the only language worth speaking, and the overseer did not like quiet strength. He liked broken men. He liked bowed heads. He liked the sound of pleading. The boy did not plead. So the overseer began to test him. First came extra work. Heavy loads meant for 2 men placed on the boy's shoulders alone. Long hours in the sun without water. Tasks designed not to accomplish anything useful but to grind a person down. Then came the insults. Sharp words thrown like stones, meant to provoke anger. But the boy remembered his mother's voice. Do not let them build their house inside your head. He held his silence like armor. That silence irritated the overseer more than open rebellion ever could. One afternoon, the sky hung low with thick gray clouds that promised rain. The workers moved slowly through the fields, exhausted from the heavy heat. The boy's mother stumbled. She had been sick for days, though she tried to hide it. Her hands trembled when she worked, and sometimes she pressed a palm against her ribs as if something inside hurt deeply. When she dropped her tool, the overseer saw it. He walked toward her slowly, his boots crunching against the dry dirt. The field went quiet. The overseer lifted his whip. She tried to rise quickly, but her body betrayed her. Her knees buckled and she fell again. The whip cracked through the air. The sound sliced across the field like lightning. The boy moved before he could stop himself. He stepped between the overseer and his mother. The entire plantation froze. The overseer stared at him in disbelief. No enslaved man stepped between the whip and its target. Not if he wanted to live. The overseer's lips curled into a slow smile. Well, he said softly. Looks like this one thinks he's something special. The boy said nothing, but he did not move aside. The overseer raised the whip again. This time the boy caught it. The leather snapped tight between his hand and the overseer's grip. For a moment, neither of them moved. The other workers stood frozen in terror. Everyone knew what would follow. The overseer yanked the whip free and struck him across the shoulder. Pain exploded through the boy's body, hot and blinding. But he did not fall. That was the moment the overseer decided he would break him. The punishment that followed lasted hours. They tied him to a post in the yard where everyone could see. The whip rose and fell until blood soaked his shirt and dripped into the dust. Still, he did not beg. Even when the pain blurred his vision and turned the sky into spinning gray shapes, he refused to give the overseer what he wanted. When night finally came, they threw him into a small storage shed behind the barn. Iron shackles clamped around his ankles. The door slammed shut. Inside, darkness swallowed everything. For a long time he lay on the dirt floor, barely able to breathe. The wounds on his back burned like fire. But somewhere in the darkness he heard something else. Rain. Soft at first, then stronger. Water tapping against the roof. The smell of wet earth drifting through the cracks in the wood. The forest was close. Closer than it had ever felt before. He thought about his mother's stories. About the maroons who moved like shadows beneath those trees. About people who refused to live as property. Outside, thunder rolled across the sky. The boy slowly pushed himself upright. Pain screamed through his body, but he forced his legs to move. His shackles scraped against the dirt as he shuffled toward the door. Through a narrow crack in the wood, he could see the dark outline of the forest beyond the fields. The rain thickened. Wind rattled the loose boards of the shed. And in that moment, something inside him shifted. For the first time in his life, the fence between him and the forest felt smaller than the cage behind him. He sat quietly in the darkness, listening. Hours passed. The plantation slept. Somewhere nearby, a guard coughed. Boots shuffled on wet ground. Then silence returned. The boy studied the iron around his ankles. The shackles were old. Rust had crept along the edges. He twisted carefully, feeling the metal bite against his skin. The chain connecting the cuffs scraped across the floor. He tested the small nail that held the hinge together. It moved, only slightly, but it moved. Very slowly, with fingers stiff from pain, he began to work at it. Time crawled forward like a wounded animal. The storm outside grew stronger, wind roaring through the trees, rain hammering the roof. The nail loosened, little by little, until finally, with a faint metallic click, it slipped free. The shackle opened. The boy froze, hardly daring to breathe. He lifted the iron ring away from his ankle. For a long moment he simply stared at it lying on the dirt floor. The chain that had held him his entire life suddenly looked small. Very quietly, he rose to his feet and stepped toward the door. The storm swallowed every sound. When he pushed the door open, the hinges groaned softly, but the thunder drowned it out. Rain soaked his face instantly. Cold wind wrapped around his wounded back. He did not hesitate. He ran. Across the muddy yard, past the silent barns, toward the dark wall of trees waiting beyond the fields. Behind him, the plantation slept. Ahead of him, the forest opened like a mouth swallowing the night. And before the sun rose again, the boy who had been owned by another man would disappear into that darkness forever. When the plantation awoke at dawn, the alarm spread quickly. The overseer shouted orders. Dogs were brought out. Men mounted horses. The hunt began. But the forest was vast, and the boy had already vanished beneath its shadow. The trees closed behind him like a curtain, and the plantation disappeared as if it had never existed. Rain fell through the leaves in cold silver threads. The boy stumbled through mud and roots, slipping, catching himself on branches, pushing deeper into darkness with the desperate strength that only fear can give a human body. Behind him, dogs barked somewhere far across the fields, faint at first, then louder as the plantation men realized what had happened. Lanterns would soon move along the fence line. Horses would spread across the edges of the forest. They would expect him to run blindly. Most runaways did. Panic drove them straight until hunger or exhaustion dragged them down. But the boy remembered the stories whispered in the cabins at night. He remembered the word his mother spoke with reverence: maroons. Somewhere in this endless forest, there were people who had learned how to vanish. People who had turned wilderness into protection. People who had refused to remain prey. The rain washed the scent from his skin and soaked the ground so deeply that even the dogs would struggle to follow a trail. Still, he did not stop moving. The forest floor rose and dipped, thick with roots and fallen branches. Thorn vines scratched his arms and tore his clothes. Once he nearly stepped on a snake coiled beneath a rock, its body slick with rain, its head lifting in silent warning before sliding away into the wet leaves. Hours passed. The storm slowly drifted away, and the sky began to lighten with the pale gray of early morning. The boy slowed then, not because he wanted to, but because his body demanded it. Every breath felt like swallowing knives. His back throbbed with each step where the overseer's whip had torn the skin open. Blood mixed with rainwater and ran down his sides. He leaned against a tree and listened. The forest was different now. Birds called cautiously from the branches. Insects hummed softly in the damp air. Somewhere distant, a river moved with a slow, steady murmur. But beneath those natural sounds, he heard something else. Dogs, faint but unmistakable. The hunt had entered the forest. He forced himself away from the tree and moved again, this time more carefully. The forest was thick and confusing to someone who did not understand its patterns. Trails twisted and vanished. Hills rose unexpectedly from the ground. Pools of dark water lay hidden beneath layers of fallen leaves. But the boy began to notice small things. Moss grew heavier on one side of the trunks. Water collected in the shallow dips between roots. The wind carried the scent of the river more strongly whenever the land sloped downward. Instinct guided him as much as thought. Hunger gnawed at his stomach. By midday, he found a cluster of dark berries hanging from a thorn bush. He hesitated. Eating the wrong plant could kill him faster than any hunter. But the berries matched the ones he had seen birds pecking earlier that morning. He ate slowly, waiting for the bitterness that might signal poison. None came. The sun climbed higher behind the clouds. Sweat mixed with rain and blood on his skin. At a shallow stream, he drank deeply and washed the mud from his face. When he lifted his head, he froze. Across the water, someone stood watching him. A tall man stepped forward from behind a tree trunk. His skin was dark like the boy's, but his posture carried a quiet confidence the boy had never seen among enslaved men. The stranger held a long rifle across his chest. His eyes studied the boy carefully, measuring every movement. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then the stranger nodded slightly toward the shackles still hanging loosely from the boy's ankle. "Runaway." The boy said nothing. The stranger gestured toward the trees behind him. "Come." After an hour, the trees opened into a hidden clearing where several small huts stood beneath thick leaves woven together to hide the smoke of cooking fires. Men and women moved quietly through the space, carrying baskets, sharpening blades, tending to small gardens hidden between the trees. Children watched from the shadows with curious eyes. The boy understood immediately. Maroons, the people from the whispered stories. The stranger led him to an older man sitting beside a fire. The man's hair was streaked with gray, and his hands bore deep scars from years of work and war. He looked at the boy for a long moment before speaking. "You came alone." The boy nodded. The old man studied the wounds across his back. "You will stay until you heal." The boy felt his knees weaken with relief. But the old man raised a finger. "This forest protects only those who learn its rules. If you stay, you will learn." The boy nodded again. Over the next weeks, his wounds slowly closed. The Maroons treated him with quiet efficiency, packing herbs into the deep cuts and wrapping his back with cloth. No one asked many questions. In the forest, survival mattered more than stories. When he could stand without shaking, the old man began his lessons. "The forest speaks if you listen," he said. The boy learned to read the ground. Fresh footprints bent the grass differently than old ones. Broken twigs pointed toward the direction a traveler had moved. Even the silence of birds could reveal the presence of strangers. He learned to move without sound, placing each step carefully along roots or stones. He learned to climb trees with speed, using the rough bark for grip. He learned to disappear into shadows, even in daylight. The forest slowly changed from a maze into a map. Months passed. The boy grew stronger. The Maroons gave him a rifle and taught him patience. Shooting was the final lesson. "Anyone can pull a trigger," the old man said. "A hunter waits." The boy practiced for hours, aiming at small knots on distant trees until his arms trembled from holding the rifle steady. One evening, a scout returned to the village with urgent news. Bounty hunters had entered the forest. 9 of them. Experienced trackers hired by plantation owners to recover runaways. They carried rifles and dogs. They believed no fugitive could escape them once the hunt began. The old man listened quietly. Then he turned to the boy. "They come for you." The boy understood. The overseer had not forgotten. A runaway who struck a white man could not be allowed to vanish without punishment. The hunters would search the forest until they found him or died trying. The old man placed a hand on the boy's shoulder. "The forest has taught you. Now it will test you." The boy lifted his rifle. For the first time since escaping the plantation, he felt no fear, only focus. The hunters entered the forest the next morning. They moved confidently along the outer trails, dogs sniffing the damp earth while lanterns swung from their saddles. They expected an easy capture. A wounded runaway could not outrun trained men forever. What they did not know was that the runaway was no longer running. He waited high in the branches of an old oak tree as the first 2 hunters passed beneath him. Their conversation drifted upward through the leaves. They joked about the reward money waiting for them once the fugitive was dragged back in chains. The boy watched their careless movements. He remembered the overseer's whip. He remembered his mother falling into the dirt. The rifle rested steady against the tree trunk. When he pulled the trigger, the forest swallowed the sound. The first hunter fell before he understood what had happened. The second spun in confusion, searching the trees, but the second shot came before his rifle could rise. The hunt had begun, but the hunters did not yet realize they had become the prey. The forest closed again around the silence after the second shot. Leaves drifted slowly down from the branches, as if nothing had happened. The boy remained still in the oak, breathing slowly. watching the two bodies on the ground. The other hunters would hear nothing. In the forest, sound travels strangely. The thick trees and wet air swallow gunfire like deep water swallowing a stone. Far away, a bird cried once and then returned to its ordinary song. The boy climbed down carefully, touching the earth without a sound. He moved quickly to the fallen men. Their rifles were good ones, long barrels, polished wood, tools made for killing men who were running. He took their ammunition, their knives, and then dragged the bodies into the brush where vines and wet leaves hid them from sight. Then he climbed again, this time higher, moving across the branches like an animal that had grown up in the canopy. From there he could see the faint trail where the rest of the hunters were moving. They had spread out as trackers often do, searching wide circles for signs. But their mistake was the same mistake all hunters made when they entered a forest they did not know. They believed they were the only minds at work in the trees. The boy moved through the branches until he reached another tree overlooking the path ahead of them. He waited there, motionless, rifle resting along the branch, the barrel pointed down through a gap in the leaves. Time passed slowly. The sun climbed and the forest grew warmer. Sweat rolled down his neck, but he did not wipe it away. Finally, 2 more hunters appeared along the path below. These men moved more carefully. They had seen signs of disturbance in the leaves. One of them pointed toward the broken twigs where the first bodies had fallen before being dragged away. Something was wrong. They raised their rifles and scanned the trees. The boy remained perfectly still. One of the hunters stepped closer to the brush where the bodies lay hidden. He pushed the leaves aside with his boot. His eyes widened as he saw the first corpse. He opened his mouth to shout. The rifle cracked. The bullet struck him before the sound fully formed. The second hunter fired wildly into the branches, but the boy had already shifted along the limb. The man turned in circles, panic spreading through his movements as he tried to see the invisible enemy above him. The second shot ended the confusion. Again the forest returned to calm. 4 hunters were gone. 5 remained. The boy moved quickly now. He knew the others would soon notice the missing men. Hunters are cautious creatures when they realize danger walks beside them. He followed the slope downward toward the river, keeping above the ground whenever possible. In the distance, he heard voices. The remaining hunters had gathered together. They spoke angrily, arguing about what had happened. One insisted they were being stalked. Another claimed the missing men had simply lost the trail. But even from the branches, the boy could smell their fear beginning to grow. Fear makes men loud. Fear makes them careless. The river curved through a narrow gorge ahead where the trees leaned over the water and the ground became steep and slippery. The boy knew the place well. The Maroons had shown him this path weeks earlier. It was a perfect place for an ambush. He reached the gorge before the hunters and climbed onto a large rock overlooking the trail. The water below moved slowly but deep, dark as ink beneath the shadows. He settled behind the rock and waited. The hunters approached cautiously, rifles raised, dogs pulling against their leashes. The animals whined nervously. They could smell the bodies somewhere behind them, but could not understand where the scent had gone. One of the men cursed and struck a dog with the butt of his rifle. The boy felt the anger rise in his chest, but forced it down. Anger makes a hunter careless. Patience makes him deadly. The first man stepped onto the narrow ledge beside the river. The boy fired. The man fell backward into the water with a splash that echoed between the cliffs. The others shouted and scattered for cover. Bullets slammed into the rock where the boy had been lying seconds earlier. But he had already moved. Sliding down the opposite side of the gorge, he vanished into the trees again. The hunters stared wildly at the empty rock above them. None had seen the shooter. Only the flash of smoke from the rifle had betrayed his presence. One of the men shouted that they were dealing with more than one attacker. No single runaway could move that quickly. But the boy was already climbing another tree farther along the trail. He watched them from above as they argued. 5 hunters had become 4, and now the fear among them had grown heavy enough to taste in the air. The forest listened quietly as the men gathered their courage and continued forward. unaware that the shadows above them were still watching, still waiting for the next moment when the hunt would tighten again. The hunters did not move the way they had earlier that morning. Confidence had drained from their bodies. Their steps were slower now. Their eyes moved constantly between the ground and the branches above them. The dogs strained at their ropes, whining softly, confused by the scent that seemed to appear and disappear with no pattern. 4 men remained. 4 armed hunters who had entered the forest expecting to chase a wounded runaway. Now each of them felt the quiet pressure of eyes they could not see. The boy watched them from the limbs of a tall pine where the needles thickened the shadows. He had climbed high, nearly to the point where the branches grew thin against the sky. From there he could see the narrow trail winding through the trees below. The men moved in a tight group now, their rifles ready. One of them kept glancing upward. Good, the boy thought. Fear makes men look in the wrong places, because the forest does not only hide what is above, it hides what is around. He climbed down silently along the opposite side of the trunk, sliding his hands along the rough bark until his feet touched the ground behind a wall of dense shrubs. The hunters were still studying the branches where they believed the shots had come from earlier. None of them looked behind. The boy moved slowly through the brush, circling them the way a wolf circles a herd. Every step was deliberate, every breath controlled. The Maroon Elder's lessons lived inside his muscles now. Do not rush, do not chase. Let the prey walk into the trap it cannot see. The ground sloped downward toward a patch of swampy earth where water gathered between thick roots. The boy stepped lightly onto a fallen log that stretched across the mud. The hunters followed the trail. One of the dogs suddenly barked. Its nose lifted, catching the faint scent of the boy's passage through the shrubs. The animal lunged forward. The hunter holding the rope shouted and tried to pull it back. The dog broke free. It ran straight toward the log where the boy stood. The boy did not hesitate. He raised the rifle. The shot cracked through the trees. The dog collapsed mid-stride. The hunters spun toward the sound. For the first time they saw him clearly. A tall figure standing on the log, rifle raised, eyes calm. One of the men shouted and fired. The bullet tore through leaves beside the boy's head, but he had already moved. He stepped backward into the thick swamp grass and vanished as if the earth had swallowed him. 2 of the hunters ran forward toward the fallen dog. The third man shouted for them to stop. "Don't split!" he yelled. But the warning came too late. The first man reached the edge of the swamp and stepped onto the log. The wood shifted beneath his weight. The boy fired from the reeds. The hunter fell sideways into the dark water. Mud swallowed him instantly. The second man froze in terror. He could not see the shooter, only the ripples spreading across the swamp where his companion had disappeared. 3 hunters remained. The forest had grown very quiet now. Even the birds seemed to sense the violence unfolding beneath the canopy. The remaining men pulled back onto dry ground, their faces pale with fear and rage. "This ain't one man," one of them muttered. "No runaway moves like that." The leader of the group wiped sweat from his brow and looked around the trees slowly. But the boy was already climbing again. He moved upward through a cypress tree whose branches stretched over the swamp like long arms. From there he watched the men below argue in low voices. The leader made a decision. They would leave the swamp and circle back toward higher ground. He believed the shooter was trying to trap them near the water, so they moved away from the marsh. But the boy knew something they did not. The higher ground led to a narrow ridge between 2 steep slopes covered in thick undergrowth, a place where only one man could pass at a time. He reached the ridge long before they did. Then he waited, and the forest waited with him. The ridge was narrow and uneven, a thin spine of dry earth rising between 2 slopes thick with tangled roots and heavy brush. Fallen leaves covered the ground so deeply that footsteps made almost no sound if a man knew where to place his weight. The boy moved along the ridge slowly, studying every tree and stone. He had passed this place many times during the weeks he trained with the Maroons. The elder had shown it to him once and said only a few quiet words. If a man does not know the forest chooses where he dies. The boy understood those words now. He climbed halfway up a tall hickory tree that leaned slightly over the ridge. From that position he could see both approaches. The path twisted through the undergrowth below before rising onto the narrow strip of ground. Anyone walking that trail would have no choice but to step forward one by one. He rested the rifle across a thick branch and waited. Time moved slowly. Sunlight shifted across the leaves above him and thin beams of light reached the forest floor. The boy listened to every sound. Wind brushing the canopy. A squirrel running along bark. The distant croak of frogs near the swamp behind him. Then finally he heard the hunters approaching. They were quieter now than before, moving carefully, fear sharpening their attention. But the forest still betrayed them. Boots scraping bark, cloth brushing branches, the faint rattle of metal against metal. The leader came first. He stepped onto the ridge cautiously, rifle raised, eyes searching the trees ahead. Behind him, another man followed close, and the third walked a few steps farther back. 3 men remained. The boy breathed slowly and aimed. The first shot struck the second hunter just as he reached the top of the ridge. The man dropped instantly, his rifle tumbling down the slope into the brush. The leader spun around in shock, shouting for the last man to spread out, but the narrow ground left him no space to move. The boy shifted the rifle slightly and fired again. The last man collapsed backward down the slope, crashing through the brush until his body disappeared among the leaves below. Silence returned almost immediately. Only the leader remained. He stood frozen on the ridge, his chest rising and falling rapidly. He stared into the forest with wide, furious eyes. The boy watched him from above without moving. The leader's mind raced through possibilities. More attackers hidden in the trees, maroon fighters surrounding him, an entire band of rebels closing in for the kill. But there was only one hunter waiting above him. The man slowly lowered his rifle and spoke into the quiet forest. "I know you're there." His voice was rough with anger, but also something else now. Fear. The boy did not answer. The leader took a careful step forward along the ridge. "You think this ends it?" he said loudly. "You kill me and the plantation send 20 more, 100 more." The boy remained silent. The man continued speaking as he moved, trying to draw the hidden shooter into revealing himself. "You're still a runaway. You'll always be hunted." The forest swallowed his words. The boy watched the man's breathing, the tension in his shoulders, the direction of his eyes. Hunters rely on patterns, and when patterns fail, they grow desperate. The leader suddenly raised his rifle and fired blindly into the branches above. The bullet tore through leaves several yards from the boy's position. Smoke drifted upward. The boy moved slightly along the branch, adjusting his aim. The leader reloaded quickly and stepped backward down the ridge, hoping to reach thicker cover. The boy waited until the man paused to scan the trees again. Then he fired. The shot struck the rifle out of the hunter's hands. The weapon spun away into the brush. The leader staggered but did not fall. He looked up slowly toward the tree where the shot had come from. For the first time he saw the figure watching him from the branches. The runaway slave he had come to capture. The man's eyes burned with hatred. "Do it then," he said. The boy climbed down from the tree. He stepped onto the ridge a few yards away, rifle still raised. The 2 men faced each other in the quiet forest. The leader laughed bitterly. 1 runaway against 9 hunters. No one's going to believe this story. The boy's voice was calm when he finally spoke. "They won't hear it from you." The man's laughter stopped. The final shot echoed through the trees. The forest swallowed the sound just as it had swallowed all the others. When the echo faded, the ridge returned to silence. The boy stood alone among the trees. 9 hunters had entered the forest that morning. None would leave it. For a long time the boy did not move. The forest had returned to its ordinary rhythm. Wind brushed the upper branches. A few birds called cautiously from the canopy, as if testing whether the violence had truly ended. The man on the ridge lay motionless, the rifle gone from his hands, the anger gone from his voice. The boy lowered his weapon slowly. The weight of the rifle felt different now. It was no longer simply a tool he had been taught to use. It had become the final word in a story that had begun the moment the overseer's whip struck his mother. He stood there listening to the quiet forest and realized something strange. He did not feel the wild triumph he had imagined when he first thought about revenge. Instead, he felt something steadier, something colder. Justice does not shout when it arrives. It settles. He stepped carefully past the fallen hunter and looked down the slope where the others had fallen earlier. The forest had already begun to hide them. Leaves shifted gently across their bodies. Insects moved through the grass. The earth would take them back in time. The boy turned away from the ridge and began walking deeper into the forest. The path was familiar now. The trees no longer looked like a wall, but like a network of silent guides pointing him home. After some time, the ground leveled and the dense thicket opened into the hidden clearing where the Maroons lived. A few figures stepped out from the shadows when they saw him approach. They had heard the distant shots hours earlier, but none had followed. In the forest, each hunter must finish his own work. The old man who had trained him stood near the fire. His eyes moved from the boy's face to the rifle in his hands. "How many?" he asked quietly. "9," the boy answered. The elder nodded slowly. For a moment, neither man spoke. Around them, the village continued its quiet life. Women prepared food beside low fires. Children carried water from a small spring hidden behind a cluster of rocks. A pair of young men sharpened blades beneath a tree. The forest community did not celebrate the death of hunters. They simply understood it. The elder finally placed a hand on the boy's shoulder. "You were not running today?" he said. The boy shook his head. "No." The elder's voice carried no surprise. The forest teaches the hunted how to become the hunter. That night, the village gathered around the fire. The story spread quietly among them, as stories always do in places where memory is stronger than paper. A runaway slave had faced 9 armed bounty hunters alone. The forest had swallowed every one of them. But the elder spoke carefully when the younger fighters asked about revenge. "This is not about revenge," he said. "Revenge burns quickly and leaves nothing behind. What happened today is something different." The boy sat silently beside the fire, listening to the crackle of wood. In the flames, he saw the long road that had brought him there. The cabin with the leaking roof. His mother whispering stories in the darkness. The overseer's whip. The rainstorm the night he escaped. The first lessons among the Maroons. The forest had shaped each step. Later that night, he walked alone to the edge of the clearing. The trees stretched endlessly beyond the village. Somewhere far away, the plantation still stood. The overseer might still walk its yards shouting orders. The owner might still sit comfortably in his white house believing the world belonged to him. But something had changed. 9 hunters had entered the forest believing they were chasing property. Instead, they had met a man who no longer belonged to anyone. The boy looked up at the canopy where the stars flickered through the branches. He thought about his mother. He wondered if word of what had happened would ever reach the plantation. Perhaps someone would whisper about it in the cabins at night. Perhaps a tired worker would tell the story to a frightened child who believed escape was impossible. Maybe they would speak about a runaway who learned the forest so well that even the hunters feared to follow him. The boy turned back toward the firelight of the hidden village. He was no longer simply the boy who had run into the woods. He had become something the plantation could never control again. And somewhere deep in the forest, the shadows listened and remembered. Days passed, but the forest did not forget what had happened. Word travels in strange ways in places where there are no roads. A broken branch here, a boot print there, a rifle found abandoned beside a stream, a dog wandering alone with no master behind it. Men from distant plantations would eventually hear that 9 hunters had gone into the deep woods and never returned. Some would say the forest swallowed them. Others would whisper about maroons who moved like ghosts between the trees. But inside the hidden village, life continued quietly. The boy woke each morning before the sun reached the canopy. He helped carry water, check traps, gather roots and herbs along the narrow trails that wound through the forest like veins. The elder watched him closely during those days, not with suspicion but with careful attention. Killing men changes a person. The elder knew that well. One evening, as the sun faded and the sky turned deep blue above the treetops, the elder called the boy to walk with him beyond the edge of the clearing. They moved along a narrow path until the sounds of the village disappeared behind them. After some time, they reached a high ridge where the forest stretched endlessly in every direction. The elder sat on a fallen log and looked out over the trees. "The hunters came because they believed they owned you," he said quietly. The boy nodded. They believed the forest belonged to them too. The elder picked up a small stone and turned it slowly in his hand. Men like that think land, water, and people are all the same kind of possession, but the forest does not recognize ownership. It only recognizes balance. The boy listened carefully. The elder's voice grew softer. "What happened on that ridge will travel farther than you think. Plantation owners will hear about it. Hunters will hear about it. Some will become more careful. Others will become more cruel." The boy looked across the sea of trees. "Do you think they will stop sending hunters?" The elder shook his head slowly. "No. Fear does not stop men who believe they have power. But stories change the way those men walk into the forest." The boy understood. Before that day, the hunters had entered with confidence. They had believed the runaway was weak and alone. Now the forest carried a different reputation, a place where the hunted might be watching from above. Weeks passed and the seasons slowly shifted. The rains came less often, and the air grew warmer under the thick canopy. The boy continued training with the maroons. He learned to track animals silently through the brush, to build hidden shelters beneath fallen trees, to move through the forest at night guided only by the stars glimpsed between branches. The rifle remained his companion, but the elder reminded him often that a hunter's greatest weapon was patience. One afternoon, a scout returned to the village with news from the outer trails. A group of armed riders had appeared near the edge of the forest. They had asked questions at nearby farms about missing hunters. The plantation owners had begun searching again. The village gathered quietly to discuss what this meant. Some believed the riders would not dare enter deep into the forest after what had happened to the first group. Others warned that anger can drive men into foolish decisions. The boy listened to the conversation without speaking. When the meeting ended, he walked alone along the outer trail where tall cypress trees rose from dark pools of water. The forest was quiet except for the slow movement of insects and distant birds. He climbed a tree overlooking the path that led toward the plantations and sat there watching the fading light. Hours passed before he finally saw movement far away through the trees. Riders. Not hunters moving carefully through the forest, but plantation men traveling along the outer paths with torches and rifles. They did not venture deeper. They circled the edges like wolves, unsure whether to approach a hidden trap. The boy remained still as the night deepened. Eventually, the riders turned back toward the open land beyond the forest. They had come searching for answers, but the forest had given them none. When the boy returned to the village, the elder was waiting beside the fire. "They will come again," the boy said. "Yes," the elder replied. "But tonight they remembered something important." The boy looked into the flames. "What is that?" The elder smiled faintly. "The forest is not empty." The fire crackled softly between them. Somewhere far beyond the trees, plantations still stood, and chains still clattered in the yards of men who believed they controlled the world. But deep inside the forest, another truth had taken root. A runaway had once entered those woods bleeding and afraid. Now he walked beneath the branches as one of its protectors, and the story of the day 9 hunters became prey had only just begun to travel. Seasons turned the way they always do in the forest, slowly and without ceremony. The air thickened as summer deepened. Insects hummed constantly beneath the leaves. The river that curved along the edge of the maroon territory grew lower and slower under the heavy heat. Life in the hidden village moved with quiet purpose. People worked, hunted, repaired roofs woven from branches, and watched the outer trails. The boy became part of that rhythm. At first, he had been the runaway who arrived wounded and desperate. Now he moved through the forest with the same confidence as the others. He knew where the ground dipped into hidden marsh, where deer crossed the streams at dawn, where the wind shifted when a storm approached. And he learned something else that the elder had not spoken aloud before. The forest was not only a refuge. It was a battlefield that stretched for miles beneath the canopy. Every trail, every ridge, every patch of swamp could become a place where the balance between freedom and capture was decided. One evening, a scout returned from the outer edges of the territory with troubling news. Another group had entered the forest. Not bounty hunters this time. Soldiers. Plantation owners had grown impatient after losing their hired trackers. They had sent men with uniforms, rifles, and orders to search deeper. The village gathered once again in the clearing as the sun disappeared behind the trees. Torches flickered against the trunks while the elder listened carefully to the scout's report. "They move slowly," the scout said. "They are afraid, but they carry enough guns to burn the forest if they choose." The elder nodded. "Fear makes men dangerous." The boy stood near the edge of the circle listening. The memory of the ridge and the fallen hunters still lived in his mind. The soldiers were not chasing him alone anymore. They were chasing the idea that people could escape and survive here. The elder's voice rose above the murmurs of the group. "We do not fight the soldiers the way they expect. The forest will decide how this ends." Small groups of maroons spread through the outer trails that night. They moved silently, placing watchers along the ridges and near the narrow paths where strangers would struggle to pass. The boy joined one of these groups. The elder walked beside him as they followed a twisting trail toward the river valley. The soldiers camped near the old cedar grove. The elder said quietly, "They will try to reach the higher ground tomorrow." The boy nodded. That path crossed several narrow ridges and swamp channels. It was difficult terrain even for someone who knew the forest well. They climbed a tall ridge overlooking the cedar grove before dawn. From the branches above, they could see the soldiers' campfires glowing faintly through the trees. The men moved restlessly below, some cleaning rifles, others pacing nervously near the edges of the clearing. The forest unsettled them. Every creaking branch sounded like a hidden enemy. Every shadow seemed alive. The elder studied the camp silently for a long time. Finally, he turned to the boy. "Do you see the difference between hunters and soldiers?" The boy watched the men below. "The hunters believe they were stronger than the forest," he said slowly. "The soldiers fear it." The elder nodded. Fear can break a group faster than bullets. When the sun rose, the soldiers began their march deeper into the woods. They moved in tight formation, rifles ready, trying to follow a rough map that showed little more than rivers and vague trails. The Maroons did not attack immediately. Instead, they guided the soldiers deeper into the maze of trees and swamps. Paths that seemed simple slowly narrowed into confusing tangles. Water forced the men to detour across slippery ground. Their formation broke apart again and again. By midday, frustration had replaced their early caution. The boy watched from the branches as the soldiers argued among themselves. Some wanted to turn back. Others insisted they were close to finding the hidden settlement rumored to exist somewhere in the forest. The elder leaned close to the boy and whispered, "Now the forest begins its lesson." They moved quietly along the ridge ahead of the soldiers. Fallen branches were arranged to block certain paths while leaving others open. Trails that appeared clear led into muddy marshes where boots sank deeply into the ground. By evening, the soldiers were exhausted and angry. They had marched all day and discovered nothing except endless trees. The forest had swallowed their strength. The boy watched their campfire flicker weakly in the distance that night. The elder spoke softly beside him. Men who come here with chains in their minds always believe the forest is empty land waiting to be claimed, but the forest belongs to those who listen to it. The boy looked out across the dark canopy stretching beyond the firelight. Somewhere far away, plantations still stood, and more soldiers would eventually follow the same trails. The struggle was far from finished, but the forest had already begun shaping the story of what would happen to those who entered it believing they were the masters of the hunt. Night wrapped the forest in thick darkness, the kind that makes distance disappear and turns every sound into a warning. The soldiers' campfire flickered weakly among the cedar trees, its glow barely reaching the surrounding trunks. From high in the branches above, the boy watched them closely. The men were tired now. Their shoulders sagged as they sat around the fire, passing a small flask between them and muttering about the endless woods. One of them stared into the trees as if expecting eyes to appear in the shadows. Another cleaned his rifle again and again, though it was already spotless. Fear had begun its quiet work among them. The elder rested beside the boy on the same branch, his voice barely louder than the rustle of leaves. "Do you hear it?" The boy listened carefully. At first there was only the ordinary noise of the forest. Crickets chirping, wind moving softly through the canopy, the distant splash of something entering the river far below. But beneath those sounds there was another rhythm now. Uneven breathing from the camp, nervous shifting of boots against dirt, the slow cracking of sticks as soldiers turned their heads again and again toward imagined movement. "The forest is inside their minds now," the elder said. "That is where the battle is won." The boy studied the soldiers below. He remembered the hunters on the ridge weeks earlier, how their confidence had turned into panic when the forest began closing around them. The same change was happening here. These men had come with uniforms and orders, but the trees did not care about uniforms or orders. The boy lowered himself slowly from the branch and slipped down the trunk until his feet touched the ground. The elder followed silently. They moved through the brush along a narrow path that circled the soldiers' camp at a distance. Other Maroons waited in the darkness between trees, barely visible shapes blending with the shadows. No one spoke. The plan had already been decided. The forest itself would push the soldiers away. When the moon rose higher above the canopy, the Maroons began moving. Not toward the camp, but around it. One man snapped a branch far to the left of the clearing. Another rustled through dry leaves behind the camp. A third let out a low whistle from deeper in the trees. The sounds were small, but deliberate. The soldiers reacted instantly. Men jumped to their feet and raised their rifles toward the darkness. Someone fired a shot blindly into the trees. The sound echoed through the forest like thunder. Then the silence returned. The Maroons shifted positions again, repeating the trick from another direction. A distant splash in the river, a branch cracking high above the ground. The soldiers turned in circles trying to find the invisible attackers. One shouted angrily that they were being surrounded. Another insisted the forest was full of rebels watching them. The boy climbed into a nearby tree and watched the confusion grow. No bullets were needed. Fear was already doing the work. After an hour, the soldiers could no longer remain still. The leader of the group ordered them to break camp and move back toward the outer trails. They packed their gear quickly, their hands shaking as they extinguished the fire. The forest beyond the clearing looked deeper and darker than it had earlier that day. As they marched away through the trees, the Maroons followed quietly above and beside them. The boy moved through the branches again, keeping pace with the retreating column. The soldiers no longer searched for the hidden village. They simply wanted to leave the forest behind. By dawn, they reached the wide dirt road that led back toward the plantations. The moment the first rider stepped into open sunlight, the tension in their bodies loosened slightly. The forest lay behind them like a wall they had no desire to face again. The boy stopped at the edge of the trees and watched them disappear down the road. The elder stepped beside him. "They will return someday," the boy said quietly. "Yes," the elder replied. but they will remember what the forest felt like. The boy looked back across the endless canopy stretching behind them. Somewhere beyond those trees, the hidden village waited, and beyond that, more runaways would someday arrive seeking freedom. The elder rested a hand on his shoulder. "What you did on the ridge began a story," he said. "Stories travel farther than men with guns." The boy nodded slowly. In the distance, the riders had become small shapes on the road. Soon they would reach the plantations and tell others what they had seen. They would speak about the deep forest where hunters vanished and soldiers lost their courage. And somewhere in those whispers, a new truth would grow. The forest was no longer just a place where runaways fled. It was a place where the hunted could become something far more dangerous. The boy turned away from the road and stepped back beneath the canopy where the shadows welcomed him home. The forest accepted him again the moment he stepped beneath the canopy. The light dimmed, the air cooled, and the familiar scent of wet earth and leaves surrounded him. Behind him, the road stretched toward the plantations where men still believed chains could hold the world in place. But inside the forest, a different order existed, one shaped by patience, silence, and memory. The boy walked beside the elder along a narrow trail that curved back toward the hidden village. Neither spoke for a long time. The forest itself seemed to carry the conversation between them. When they finally reached the clearing, smoke from the cooking fires drifted slowly upward through the branches. Children ran between the huts, laughing quietly. Women worked beside the small gardens hidden beneath thick leaves. The ordinary rhythm of life had returned, as if the soldiers had never come at all. The boy sat near the fire and watched the flames for a while. In their shifting shapes, he could still see flashes of the past. The ridge where the hunters had fallen, the dark swamp water closing over a body, the narrow path where the soldiers had turned back in fear. The elder joined him and placed another piece of wood on the fire. "You are quiet tonight," the elder said. The boy nodded slowly. "I keep thinking about the plantations, about the people still there." The elder did not answer immediately. He watched the sparks rise into the night air before speaking. "Freedom grows slowly," he said. "Like a tree, the first roots appear beneath the ground long before anyone sees the branches." The boy understood. The forest village was one root. The stories traveling beyond the trees were another. Somewhere on distant plantations, workers would whisper about what had happened in the woods. They would speak of the runaway who turned hunters into prey and soldiers into frightened travelers. Those whispers would reach ears that had begun to believe escape was impossible. Later that night, the boy walked alone to the edge of the clearing where the forest grew thick again. The moon shone faintly through the leaves. He listened to the distant sounds of the night. Frogs calling near the river, wind brushing the high branches, insects singing in endless rhythm. Somewhere far away, a dog barked faintly from the direction of the plantations. He wondered if his mother still lived in the cabin where he had grown up. He wondered if she had heard any rumor of what had happened beyond the fences. Perhaps someone had told the story quietly after dark. Perhaps the overseer himself had heard whispers about 9 hunters who vanished in the forest and soldiers who fled from shadows they could not fight. The boy hoped she knew that he had survived, that he had become something stronger than the frightened runaway who had slipped through the shed door during a storm. Behind him, the firelight flickered warmly in the clearing. The village breathed softly as people settled into sleep. He turned back toward that light. The elder's words echoed in his mind. Stories travel farther than men with guns. And now the forest carried a new story among its roots and branches. A story about a runaway slave who entered the woods bleeding and hunted, and who emerged as a guardian of the shadows. A story about 9 hunters who believed they were the masters of the hunt until the forest showed them otherwise. The boy stepped quietly into the clearing and sat once more beside the fading fire. Tomorrow the work of the village would continue. More runaways might arrive seeking shelter. More patrols might circle the edges of the forest. The struggle would not end quickly, but the balance had shifted. Somewhere beyond the trees, men with power would hesitate before sending another group into the deep woods. And inside the forest, where roots gripped the earth and the wind carried old whispers through the leaves, the legend of the hunter in the trees would continue to grow. Morning arrived slowly beneath the forest canopy. Sunlight filtered through layers of leaves in pale green beams that touched the ground like quiet fingers. The village stirred to life the way it always did, without noise or hurry. Fires were rekindled, water was carried from the hidden spring, and watchers slipped away toward the outer trails where they would spend the day listening to the forest. The boy woke before the others and walked beyond the clearing while the air was still cool. Dew clung to the grass and the smell of damp earth filled his lungs. He climbed a familiar tree that overlooked a narrow path leading toward the outer ridges. From there he could see far through the trunks, a long corridor of shadow and light. Weeks ago he had climbed trees like this with fear beating in his chest, certain that men with dogs and rifles were only moments behind him. Now the forest felt different. Not safer, because danger would always exist beyond the edges of the village, but clearer. He understood its patterns now. A broken branch meant something. A sudden silence among birds meant something. Even the wind moving through certain leaves could reveal the direction a stranger traveled. The elder's lessons had settled deep inside him. He sat there for a long time, watching the morning unfold. A deer passed quietly along the path below, pausing to drink from a shallow stream before disappearing again into the undergrowth. Squirrels moved along branches in quick bursts of motion. The forest was alive in thousands of small ways. Eventually he climbed down and returned to the village. The elder was already awake, sitting beside the fire with a small knife in his hands as he carved a new wooden handle for a tool. "You walk early," the elder said without looking up. The boy nodded. "The forest feels different now." The elder smiled slightly. "That is because you are different now." The boy sat across from him and watched the blade shave thin curls of wood from the handle. "Do you think the plantations will stop sending men here?" The elder shook his head slowly. "Power does not give up easily, but each time the forest sends them back empty, the story grows stronger." Later that day, another scout returned from the outer trails. This one carried a piece of cloth torn from a uniform sleeve. The soldiers had reached the plantations and told their story, the scout reported. Some men there believed them. Others said the forest had frightened them into imagining enemies that did not exist. But none of them had returned to search again. The boy listened quietly. That hesitation was the beginning of something important. Fear had entered the minds of the men who once walked confidently beneath these trees. As the sun lowered behind the canopy, the boy walked again toward the ridge where he had once faced the last hunter. The path felt almost peaceful now. Grass had begun to grow over the disturbed soil where the fight had taken place. The forest was already erasing the violence, folding it back into the quiet rhythm of roots and rain. He stood there for a long moment, remembering the moment when the hunter's rifle had fallen from his hands and the forest had gone silent. The memory no longer burned with anger. Instead, it carried a kind of calm certainty. The forest had not turned him into a killer. It had turned him into a guardian of a place that allowed people to live without chains. As evening settled across the trees, he began walking back toward the village again. The sky above the canopy glowed orange before fading into deep blue. Smoke from the cooking fires drifted upward once more. Voices rose softly in the clearing as the village gathered for another quiet night. The boy paused at the edge of the trees and looked back across the endless forest stretching behind him. Somewhere beyond those shadows, the plantations still stood, and somewhere beyond them, the world continued to move as if nothing had changed. But inside the forest, a new truth had taken root. A runaway slave had once stepped into those woods hunted and wounded. The forest had taught him how to survive. It had taught him how to listen, how to move unseen, how to wait. And when the hunters came believing they owned the night, the forest had shown them something they had never imagined. That the hunted could learn the secrets of the trees. That patience could turn fear into strength. and that once a man truly learned the forest would never let him stand alone again.